On the morning of June 4th, 1980, the bodies of 12 men were pulled from the waters off Monmouth County, New Jersey. Each had been weighted down with chains and anchors, dumped like refuse into the Atlantic. It wasn't drugs, it wasn't organized crime. It started over fishing nets, over who had the right to cast them and where. The victims were commercial fishermen, men who had worked these waters for decades, men with wives waiting at kitchen tables and children asleep in back bedrooms. The fog that morning was thick enough to muffle the Coast Guard's engines as they hauled the dead from the deep. Some bodies had been in the water less than 48 hours. "I've seen a lot," one investigator would later testify, "but nothing like this, not over fish." If you have the courage to hear this story, like and subscribe. The following contains descriptions of graphic violence based on real events. By the late spring of 1980, the Jersey Shore fishing towns had been bleeding out for years. The canneries that once employed hundreds had shuttered. The processing plants stood empty, their windows broken, their parking lots overtaken by weeds pushing through cracked asphalt. What remained was a skeletal fleet of fishing boats and the men stubborn enough to work them. In Long Branch and Belmar, in Seabright, and the small unincorporated stretches between, families lived on what the ocean would give them, which by 1980 wasn't much. Fuel prices had tripled since the oil crisis. Foreign factory ships, massive vessels that could process catches at sea, had moved into waters that had once been worked by local boats. A man could spend 12 hours on the water and come back with barely enough to cover his diesel. The ones who survived did so by knowing their territory intimately. The underwater shelves, the migration patterns, the spots where bluefish ran thick in June. These weren't secrets written down, they were inherited, passed from father to son like the boats themselves, held close as family scripture. To share your grounds was weakness, to defend them was honor. In the cramped galley of a 40-foot trawler called the Maria Elena, Joe De Silva sat with his sons on the evening of June 2nd. The boat was tied up at the Belmar Municipal Dock, creaking against its mooring lines. The smell of diesel and fish guts hung in the air, cut by cigarette smoke from the pack Joe kept in his shirt pocket. His two boys, Danny, 23, and Michael, 19, ate cold sandwiches and said nothing. The silence wasn't unusual. There wasn't much to say anymore. The De Silvas had fished these waters for 3 generations, since Joe's grandfather had emigrated from the Azores with nothing but a pocket knife and a willingness to work. Now that legacy was drowning in debt. The boat needed engine repairs Joe couldn't afford. The bank had sent letters he'd stopped opening. That afternoon, Joe had seen Frank Callahan's boat, the Rosemary Ann, anchored over the ridge. Joe's father had shown him as a boy the spot where the blues ran every June without fail. The Callahans had their own grounds, their own inherited knowledge, but fuel was expensive and the De Silva Ridge was closer to port. It was a calculated insult, or perhaps just desperation wearing another man's face. Joe stubbed out his cigarette. "Tomorrow," he told his sons, "we settle this." Across the harbour, Frank Callahan was having dinner with his own family. His wife, Margaret, had made pot roast, stretching the meat with potatoes and carrots to feed their 4 sons and 2 daughters. The Callahans had come to New Jersey from Ireland 3 generations back, settling into the fishing trade with the same fierce pride as the Portuguese families they worked alongside. Frank was 52 years old, a deacon at St. Rose of Lima, known for his temper, but also for his fairness. He'd never cheated a man in his life. His sons, Patrick, Sean, Thomas, and Kevin, ranged from 18 to 28. All of them worked the boats. All of them knew the code. You didn't fish another man's grounds without permission. But the code had grown complicated. The grounds weren't legally owned by anyone. The county had no jurisdiction over water rights that far out. What existed was custom, and custom was breaking down under the weight of economic collapse. Frank had heard Joe Da Silva was angry about something, the nets, the ridge, some perceived slight. He'd meant to talk to the man, sort it out the way such things had always been sorted out, a conversation at the dock, maybe a beer at Connolly's. But there hadn't been time. The weather window was closing and the fish wouldn't wait. "We'll talk to Joe when we get back," Frank told Patrick that night. They never got the chance. The morning of June 3rd broke grey and windless, the kind of still that made veteran fishermen uneasy. Both families launched before dawn, the Da Silvas from Belmar, the Callahans from Seabright. By 7 in the morning, both boats were on the water, heading for the same coordinates. The ridge lay about 8 miles offshore, a submerged geological feature that concentrated baitfish and, in turn, the bluefish that fed on them. It was valuable territory in a season when every dollar counted. Joe Da Silva had brought his brother Carlos, a man of 45 who'd done 2 tours in Vietnam and never spoke about either. Carlos hadn't wanted to come. He'd seen enough violence for one lifetime, but Joe had insisted, and family was family. In the fog, sound carried strangely. The Da Silvas heard the Rosemary Ann before they saw her, the distinctive knock of her diesel engine, the voices of men calling to each other across the deck. When the boats came within hailing distance, Joe Da Silva cut his engine. Frank Callahan did the same. For a long moment, the two vessels drifted in the grey silence, separated by perhaps 50 yards of flat, oily water. What was said in those first minutes would later be disputed. Some claimed Joe demanded the Callahans leave immediately. Others said Frank offered to share the grounds, a compromise that Joe rejected. The only certainty is what happened next, a gunshot, then screaming, then more shots echoing across the water. The investigation would later determine that the first shot came from the Maria Elena. Ballistics matched a .30-06 rifle registered to Carlos Da Silva, a Remington 700 he'd owned since 1972. Whether that first shot was fired in anger or panic, whether it was aimed to kill or merely to intimidate, no one would ever know for certain. What is known is that it struck Patrick Callahan, the eldest son, in the shoulder. He fell backward onto the deck of the Rosemary Ann. His brothers rushed to help him. Frank Callahan scrambled for the shotgun he kept in the wheelhouse for shooting sharks off the lines. He never reached it. The second shot from the Da Silva boat caught him in the chest. He collapsed against the gunwale, already dying. "It happened so fast," Carlos Da Silva would later testify. "I didn't have time to think. Joe was shooting, the other boat was screaming. I shot." Within 90 seconds, 5 men were down on the Callahan boat. Sean Callahan, 25, had managed to return fire with a pistol his father kept in a tackle box. He struck Joe Da Silva in the arm, a wound that would later require 30 stitches. But the Da Silvas had more firepower and better position. The Callahan boat was drifting, its engine still cut, while Joe maneuvered the Maria Elena to close the distance. By the time the shooting stopped, Frank Callahan and 3 of his sons lay dead or dying on the blood-slicked deck. The fog had thickened by mid-morning, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. No other vessels witnessed what happened next. The Maria Elena came alongside the Rosemary Ann, and the Da Silvas boarded. Thomas Callahan, 22, had survived by hiding in the fish hold, pressed against the hull, listening to his father and brothers die above him. He would later describe hearing voices, footsteps on the deck, the methodical sounds of men working. They were talking like it was normal, he told investigators, like they were cleaning fish. The Da Silvas stripped the bodies of identification, wallets, watches, wedding rings. They weighted each corpse with anchor chain and pushed them over the side. Patrick Callahan was still breathing when he went into the water. Kevin Callahan, 18, the youngest, had tried to swim for it at some point during the massacre. They found his body 3 miles from the others, shot twice in the back, weighted down with a length of iron pipe lashed to his ankles. When Thomas Callahan finally emerged from the fish hold, believing the attackers had left, Joe De Silva was waiting on deck. "You saw nothing," Joe said. "You go home and tell them it was an accident. The boat sank, you understand?" Thomas nodded. He was 19 years old, covered in his brother's blood, trembling so badly he could barely stand. Joe De Silva studied him for a long moment, then raised his rifle. But Carlos De Silva grabbed his brother's arm. "Enough," Carlos said. It was the first word anyone had spoken in several minutes. "He's a kid, Joe, let him go." The two brothers argued on the deck of the Rosemary Ann, while Thomas Callahan stood frozen, waiting to learn whether he would live or die. Around them, the fog pressed in, muffling everything, turning the world into a grey void without horizon or reference. Joe De Silva was bleeding heavily from his arm wound. His face had gone pale, his eyes unfocused with shock and adrenaline. He'd killed 4 men in the space of minutes. A man who'd never been in a fistfight, who coached Little League and attended Mass most Sundays, who had once pulled a drowning stranger from the surf at Sandy Hook. "He'll talk," Joe said. "He'll go to the cops." "He won't," Carlos replied. "Will you?" Thomas shook his head. He would have promised anything in that moment. Carlos released his grip on his brother. "We need to go. The bleeding's bad, and there'll be more of them when these don't come back." Joe stared at Thomas for a long moment, then lowered the rifle. "If you talk," he said, "we'll come for your mother, your sisters, everyone." The De Silvas left Thomas Callahan alone on his family's boat, surrounded by blood and silence, with nothing to do but pilot the Rosemary Ann back to shore. The killings should have ended there. They didn't. When Thomas Callahan brought the empty boat back to Seabright that afternoon, the news spread through the fishing community like fire through dry timber. Margaret Callahan collapsed on the dock when she heard. Her screams brought neighbors running. By sunset, word had reached the extended Callahan family, cousins, uncles, in-laws, men who had their own boats and their own rifles. They gathered at Frank Callahan's house that night, perhaps a dozen of them, drinking whiskey and talking about what had to be done. "The cops won't do anything," said Eddie Callahan, Frank's brother. "Not fast enough, not right." What happened next remains contested. The official investigation would conclude that the Callahan relatives launched a retaliatory raid on the De Silva family compound around midnight on June 3rd, but some witnesses claimed the violence was defensive, that the De Silvas came to the Callahan neighborhood first, looking to silence Thomas before he could talk. The forensic evidence was ambiguous. 8 more men died that night, 6 of them De Silvas or their associates, 2 of them Callahan relatives caught in crossfire. Danny De Silva, Joe's eldest son, was found in the cab of his pickup truck, shot through the windshield. Joe's wife, Maria, discovered the body when she went outside to see what the noise was. By dawn on June the 4th, the death toll had reached 12. The Coast Guard found the weighted bodies. The county sheriff found the rest. The investigation that followed would consume the Monmouth County Prosecutor's Office for 18 months. More than 200 witnesses were interviewed. Ballistics experts matched casings to weapons from both families. The FBI was called in when initial evidence suggested the killings might be connected to organized crime, a theory that was eventually dismissed. These weren't mobsters, lead prosecutor Howard Kendall would tell reporters. These were fishermen, neighbors. That's what makes it so hard to understand. The difficulty was establishing who had started the violence, and therefore who bore primary responsibility. Thomas Callahan's testimony was central but compromised. He had survived by promising silence. He had witnessed his family die. His account shifted under cross-examination, details changing, chronologies blurring. Defense attorneys argued he was an unreliable narrator, traumatized beyond coherence. The prosecution countered that his core account remained consistent. The De Silvas had fired first, killed 4 men, and weighted their bodies to hide the crime. Whatever happened afterward was response, not initiation. Carlos de Silva, the only surviving adult De Silva with direct knowledge of the initial confrontation, refused to testify. He invoked the Fifth Amendment and sat stone-faced through every court appearance. Joe De Silva had died in the overnight violence, shot twice in his own driveway, probably by Eddie Callahan, though this was never proven. The man who had started it all wasn't alive to face judgment. The jury would have to decide what to do with those who remained. The trial began in November of 1980 in a wood-panelled courtroom in Freehold that smelled of floor wax and old paper. 3 defendants sat at the defense table: Carlos De Silva, Michael De Silva, and Eddie Callahan. The charges ranged from first-degree murder to accessory after the fact. The gallery was packed with members of both families, separated by an aisle and 2 decades of accumulated grievance. Margaret Callahan attended every session, dressed in black, her face expressionless. Maria De Silva came twice, then stopped. The whispers and hostile stares had become unbearable. The prosecution's case rested on physical evidence and Thomas Callahan's testimony. The defense argued self-defense, provocation, the fog of sudden violence in which no one had time to think. These men didn't wake up that morning planning to kill anyone, defense attorney Robert Failer told the jury. They went out to fish. When the shooting started, they reacted like any man would. They defended themselves, their families, their lives. The prosecution showed photographs of the weighted bodies being pulled from the ocean. They introduced the anchor chains, the rope, the methodical way the corpses had been prepared for disposal. This isn't self-defense, prosecutor Kendall argued. Self-defense doesn't involve hiding the evidence. These men didn't just kill, they tried to make their victims disappear. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned, the courtroom fell silent. Carlos De Silva was found guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder. The sentencing took place 3 weeks later in the same courtroom before the same judge. Carlos De Silva received 4 consecutive life sentences without possibility of parole. He showed no reaction when the verdict was read. He just sat there, one journalist reported, like it was happening to someone else. Michael De Silva, who had been on the Maria Elena but hadn't fired a weapon, received 15 years for accessory to murder. He would serve 11 before being released in 1991. Eddie Callahan was acquitted of murder charges related to the overnight violence. The prosecution couldn't prove he had fired the shots that killed Joe De Silva, but convicted of manslaughter in the death of Danny De Silva. He received 8 to 12 years. The other participants in the overnight violence were never charged. Witnesses refused to cooperate. Evidence had been destroyed or contaminated. The prosecutor's office eventually concluded that pursuing additional cases would be futile. "We got the ones we could get," Kendall told reporters after the final sentencing. "Justice was served as much as it can be in a situation like this." But justice, whatever it meant, couldn't resurrect the dead. It couldn't restore the families that had been destroyed. It couldn't answer the question that haunted everyone who heard the story. How had an argument over fishing grounds become a massacre? What code of honor, what desperation, what failure of imagination had made 12 deaths feel inevitable? The years passed. The fishing industry continued its decline. By 1990, most of the commercial boats that had once operated out of Belmar and Seabright had been sold or scrapped. The sons and daughters of fishermen moved inland, took jobs in offices and warehouses, tried to forget what their fathers had done for a living. Thomas Callahan never worked the water again. He moved to Pennsylvania after the trial, changed his name, married a woman who didn't know his history. He would live another 30 years without ever speaking publicly about what he'd witnessed. When a journalist tracked him down in 2005, hoping to write a retrospective on the massacre's 25th anniversary, Thomas closed the door without a word. Margaret Callahan died in 1998, still living in the same house where she'd raised her children. Her surviving daughters found boxes of photographs in the attic. Frank and the boys on the Rosemary Ann, sunburned and smiling, holding up bluefish and striped bass. The photos were donated to the local historical society, where they remain in an archive folder labeled Callahan Family, Fishing, 1960s-1970s. Maria da Silva moved to Florida after the trial. She never remarried. Carlos died in prison in 2012, having served 32 years. His body was cremated, his ashes scattered at sea by a cousin who remembered him as he'd been before the war, before the killing. A quiet boy who liked to read, who had wanted to be a teacher. By the early 2000s, the docks where the Da Silvas and Callahans had once moored their boats had been redeveloped into condominiums and seafood restaurants catering to summer tourists. The old fish processing buildings were torn down to make room for parking structures. A few pleasure boats still launched from the municipal marina, but the commercial fleet was gone. The men who had worked these waters, who had known every sandbar and current, whose grandfathers had pulled their living from the Atlantic with nothing but nets and muscle, those men had passed into history, their knowledge lost, their feuds forgotten. The site of the massacre, the underwater ridge where the shooting began, was now a popular spot for recreational fishermen. Charter boats advertised trips to the Blues Grounds, never mentioning that the name came from the bluefish runs that had once fed 2 families, that blood had been spilled there, that bodies had sunk to the bottom weighted with chain. The tourists caught fish and took photographs. They had no reason to know what had happened. History doesn't mark its killing grounds. It simply moves on, letting the ordinary wash over the terrible until the terrible becomes invisible. Some things you don't talk about, Thomas Callahan had reportedly told his wife shortly before his death in 2016. Not because they're secret, because saying them doesn't change anything. The people are gone, the reasons are gone, what's left is just the hurt, and the hurt doesn't need words. It just sits there, it just waits. The fog still rolls in some mornings along the Jersey shore, thick and grey, muffling the sound of boat engines and the cries of gulls. Fishermen, what few remain, speak of it as a kind of erasure, a way the ocean has of hiding what it knows. On those mornings, if you stand at the Belmar municipal dock where the Maria Elena once tied up, you can almost hear the past, the creak of lines, the distant knock of a diesel engine, voices carrying across the water, though you can't make out the words. 12 men died in the waters off Monmouth County in June of 1980, and now almost no one remembers their names. The court records are archived, the newspaper clippings yellowed and forgotten. What remains is the ocean itself, unchanged, indifferent, keeping its secrets beneath the surface. The fish still run in June, the boats still go out when the weather allows, and somewhere on the bottom, if you knew where to look, there are still chains rusting in the silt, though whatever they once held has long since been reclaimed by the sea.